Thanks, everyone. Thanks to Keo for the kind introduction, as well as for the hospitality, David, Keo, and many others. I have to thank Kristen for making my time delightful here, Denise, Kana, especially for the help in setting up today. And I'm probably missing others who I should be thanking as well. It's been a wonderful time here at APARC. Unfortunately, it's coming to a close, and I thank everybody who's been involved in it. And yes, this is a book project which is coming out soon, depending on how you define soon, but I'm working hard to make it happen. But yeah, the title of the talk today is Reckoning the Cold War Legacies and the Politics of Claims Making in Southeast Asia. I thought it'd be helpful a little bit to kind of back out a little bit and talk a little bit about my background as an urban scholar and an urbanist, by way of introducing this, what represents a fairly significant shift in my research in this project. And so I am an urban planner by training. I consider myself a political economist of urbanization and urban policy and planning in Southeast Asia. I've done research in the past looking at the role of community-based organizations and non-governmental organizations in advocating for low-income communities, for housing rights, land rights, infrastructure. I wrote a book that the cover on the center, Cities for Profit, which looked at new town developments, new city within the city, privatized real estate developments that were emerging across Asia. This book included case studies actually from India and China, as well as from Indonesia, but looking at this phenomenon of privately built new cities as something that was really happening throughout Asia. And more recently, I've done some research looking at flooding and politics in Jakarta, Indonesia, looking particularly at questions of property rights as cities consider the prospect of having to move large portions of their population in response to flood risk. And in fact, you have ongoing evictions of communities along riverbanks in Jakarta, in Manila, in other cities. How is that leading to a relitigation of property rights? I was looking particularly at two communities that launched a series of court cases in Jakarta contesting their evictions. I'll talk a little bit more about those communities later on. But the kind of common thread across all of these projects has been looking at the kind of transformations that large megacities in Asia have experienced with globalization and the rapid influx of foreign direct investment, financialization, increasing flows of finance into infrastructure and real estate, and the kind of pressures that places on cities in terms of increasing land values, pressures for displacement, ecological change. And so really thinking through this lens of globalization, really from the 1980s on. But again, this project really seeks to kind of dial back and actually rethink really things I've been thinking about for a long time, and rethinking the temporality with which I've been working, which is that post-1985 really moment, and I'll talk more about 1985 later in the presentation, of rapid globalization. Rethinking the temporality to focus a little bit more on the Cold War. And so the argument of the project that I'm working on is that to better understand contemporary urban issues in Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines, and I'm focusing on those three particular countries for reasons that will become apparent, urban studies scholars, people who study, as I do, cities in Asia, need to pay more attention to the legacies of political violence during Southeast Asia's hot Cold War. So I refer to this as the hot Cold War because it wasn't at all cold in Southeast Asia. Of course, there was the US war in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, but there was violence throughout the region, particularly in these three countries, where you saw, through political violence, the imposition of military authoritarian oligarchic regimes that came to dominate dominate politics. And so contemporary urban political issues represent what the project is arguing, represent a reckoning of the institutional, legal, political, and discursive legacies of that period and of these military authoritarian oligarchic kind of structures that dominated politics during that period and the violence through which they claimed power. And so the outline of the presentation is, I want to talk first about how I came to focus on urban legacies of the Cold War, why this shift in my thinking, again, on topics that I've been thinking about for a long time, why the shift to a focus on Cold War legacies is important for urban studies, why this is important for the way that we think about the issues that cities in Southeast Asia face, and again, particularly in the Philippines, Thailand, and Indonesia. And third, I want to talk about some of the theoretical kind of thinking behind this project. I mean, I ask your forbearance as I talk about theory, because that's actually what I've been thinking about most during my time here at APARC and writing the most about. And so why this shift of thinking about the Cold War as a central, problematic, and analytic for unpacking questions of urban planning and policy in Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines? Well, essentially this shift in thinking came about through a series of kind of epiphanies that I had as I was reading, as I was researching, as I was doing field research. So the way that I'll tell this story of my change in thinking is by talking about one particular moment, when I had a kind of a moment of clarity. And that was, it was, I believe, 2015. It was a while ago, a decade ago. I was interviewing a gentleman by the name of Sandiwan Sumardi, who's a very well-known social and political activist in Indonesia. He was prominent in the anti-authoritarian movement against the Suharto regime. General Suharto, of course, led Indonesia from 1966 up until 1998. But more recently, he's been working with residents along the Ciliwung River, which is a river that runs through the heart of Jakarta, floods on a regular basis. And the government's approach to mitigating flooding has been to evict communities along the rivershed, along that river, to widen the banks. And so he was working with communities that were subject to potential eviction, organizing them to negotiate with the government to find alternative solutions to the flooding that didn't involve their eviction. In fact, those communities did end up being evicted. And so the images on the left are actually a year after that interview, the eviction of Bukit and Kampung Pulo, these two communities. But throughout that interview, as we were talking, I was really distracted by something else in the room, which was a large poster that was propped up in the corner of the room. And what that poster showed, I thought it was a pretty remarkable kind of political document, was an image of the Ciliwung River snaking through the urbanscape of Jakarta, and the different urban developments popping up along that riverscape that are impinging on the river, that are clogging the river, the dumping in the river by major corporate interests, and the different kind of ecological stressors that in fact are causing the flooding, and as well as the kind of plight of the communities that are experiencing flooding, and particularly the kampung communities that are in fact being evicted as part of flood mitigation efforts. I learned just this year that poster was authored by a gentleman by the name of Yayakiat Maka, who's a prominent kind of social critic and artist. And so actually the image, this kind of thumbnail that you see at the right, I actually didn't take a picture of the poster, and I regret that to this day, but that image on the right is a more recent version of a similar kind of image of, again, the river and the kind of different stressors that it faces. But what was really fascinating about this poster was that it was really dominated by a set of figures of men. Men in military uniform, men in business suits, men in the kind of uniform of Indonesia's political elite. And they're kind of, as you can see in the figure in the upper left-hand corner here, with fangs and claws dripping, leering and looming over the river, trying to grasp at the river, clearly trying to extract value from the river. And so this poster seemed to me to be an interesting political document because it seemed to be making a very specific claim about the causes of the plight of the Ciliwung River and the residents who live along that river. And particularly to make a claim that those problems lie at the feet of a particular set of people, a particular set of actors. And for anybody who is familiar with Indonesia's political history, you know exactly who those actors are, and you know exactly the history of how they came to power. And this history goes something like this, that in 1965, there was a military coup against the government of President Sukarno at the time, but really was kind of posited as an effort to forestall a possible communist takeover of Indonesia, directed particularly at the PKI, the Communist Party of Indonesia, despite the fact that there was no evidence that the PKI, in fact, had participated peacefully in elections and was represented in Congress. And so there was no indication that there was an immediate threat of a communist takeover, but this was the premise. In the aftermath of this military takeover, the military kind of mobilized gangs of paramilitary organizations to instigate a massacre. And between 500,000 and 1 million people were massacred over the course of the next several months in 1965 and 1966. And this actually, the United States government and the United States State Department was actively involved in providing political support to the military, had actually cultivated some of these military rulers, and there is evidence that they actually provided lists of potential assassinees to the military leaders at this time. So the US was at the table. This was, of course, 1965. This is right at the beginning of the US formal involvement in the war in Vietnam. And so the US was heavily involved in regime change throughout the region. And so this act of extraordinary political violence really decimated an entire generation of alternative political leadership and atomized civil society. And on the basis of this act of state terror, the figure of President Suharto emerges as the military authoritarian ruler of Indonesia. And he, in fact, rules from 1966 formally up until 1998, over 32 years. Again, having established this strong base through an act of state terror. And Suharto ruled through, he ruled through oligarchy. And there's a lot of literature on this. I'm drawing on the work of Richard Robeson and Vedi Hadiz, two historians, political scientists who have thoroughly documented these dynamics, but essentially through the use of state concessions and licenses, land permits, the Suharto regime distributed patronage to a discrete set of oligarchic kind of crony corporations who then came to dominate the economy of Indonesia, lead among them being Lim Chio Leong of the Salim Group. At the height of Suharto's rule, the Salim Group was the largest conglomerate in Southeast Asia. And as Indonesia urbanized, and as Jakarta became an increasingly, urban development in Jakarta increasingly became a source of profit, the Suharto regime's kind of strategy of essentially rent seeking shifted towards urban development. And so the Suharto government began to hand out permits, land development location permits for large urban developments across the Jakarta region. And so this graphic that you see on the left here, this kind of spider web graphic, is a beautiful kind of documentation of this. This is by an urban scholar at the Bandung Institute of Technology named Haryo Winarso. And what this graphic illustrates is at the center of this kind of, I won't be able to go into it in detail, but at the center you have the family of President Suharto. And the lines represent linkages between Suharto and other major corporate groups that he cultivated, again, through licenses and concessions and land permits. The linkages through intermarriage and through membership on interlocking boards of directors. The various groups are represented here, the Rajawali group, the Salim group, the Mulia group. But what this graphic also shows is the major urban development projects that these different groups initiated through land permits that were provided by the Suharto government through the National Land Agency. Between 1985 and 1998, the National Land Agency handed out development permits for 80,000 hectares of land in the Jakarta metropolitan region for large-scale new city urban development projects. 80,000 hectares is about the land area of New York City. Many of these conglomerates continue to sit on these, continue to have these location permits that give them exclusive rights to purchase and develop the lands that is permitted. And in fact, they continue today to roll out new projects, such as the project that you see at the lower right-hand corner, which is a project of the Salim Group for urban development. And these are the figures that are really implicated in that Yayakyat Maka poster. These crony corporations, the head of these major conglomerates, as well as the military and political figures who gave rise to this network of oligarchic cronies and who can continue to exercise power in various forms today. And so there's a critique of that Cold War dynamic that's inherent in that poster. And I would note as well that Yayakyat Maka's work, this is another piece of artwork by the same artist, consistently kind of draws these kind of connections between, again, Cold War dynamics and contemporary urban political issues in Indonesia. But when Bukit Duri and Kampung Pulo, these two communities along the river, were evicted, they launched court cases that contested their eviction, and they quite deliberately, again, focused on Cold War era laws and their Cold War logic as they tried to contest the dynamics of eviction. And so here, this is a clip from their Facebook post this is Ciliwung Merdeka, the organization that Sandiwan Sumardi leads. There he is right there. But they specifically contested law number 51 of 1960, which is a law that has been used by successive administrations in Jakarta to justify summary eviction of communities without due process. And essentially, in the court cases, Ciliwung Merdeka argued that this was a Cold War era law, which was drafted in a time of counterinsurgency and was not appropriate to the democratic circumstance of contemporary Indonesia. And in fact, they were partially successful in those court cases. And in fact, the Jakarta municipal government, eventually those evictions were found to be illegal, and the Jakarta municipal government is now on the hook to compensate the displaced communities for their eviction. So the argument here is that, part of the argument here is that we need to listen to movements on the ground, that the ways that the movements on the ground in Jakarta are framing the kinds of issues that they face evoke these kind of Cold War legacies. And looking across the other two case studies, we can find similar instances where movements on the ground, again, evoke Cold War legacies in the way that they contest contemporary urban issues. And so another example that I'll give from Thailand, the red shirt movement, which many of us are going to be familiar with. This is a movement of the kind of working class people, predominantly from the northeast of Thailand, ethnically Lao people who consider themselves to be disenfranchised and disempowered within Thailand's contemporary politics. That launched a series of anti-authoritarian movements in the from around 2006 up until the current time. But 2010 was the critical moment where they really took to the streets after a coup against a political leader, Thaksin Shinawatra, who they see as sympathetic to their interests. I won't speak at great length about this, but in terms of the iconography of these movements, in terms of the locations that they choose for their protest, in terms of the language that they use, they continually evoke a kind of a critique of what I would argue is a Cold War dynamic, specifically a kind of an alliance between the military, the monarchy, and a political elite within Thailand. So, for example, the location of the major protest in 2010 was at the Ratchaprasong intersection in central Bangkok, a symbolic space, in part because it is surrounded by land that is owned by the Crown Property Bureau, which is the entity that manages the Bangkok and the national properties of the royal family. And so they were launching inherently a critique, both in the choice of location and in the language that they use, of essentially the enrichment of the monarchy within in the post Cold War era through an alliance with the military. In the Philippines, I would give the example of the protests of low income, of urban poor people in 2001 in defense of Joseph Estrada, a president who was impeached on corruption charges was kind of a middle-class movement. And I'm drawing here on the work of Marco Garrido, a sociologist at the University of Chicago, who argues that essentially the reason the urban poor came out in defense of Estrada was that they saw him as a kind of a counterweight to anti-poor discourses that Garrido traces in part to the era of Ferdinand Marcos, a dictator who led the Philippines from his declaration of martial law in 1972 up until 1986. And so again, what I'm arguing here is that if we listen to movements on the ground and the ways that the discourses, the iconography of protest movements frame what they're doing and the challenges they face, we see the evocation of this kind of history of the imposition of military authoritarian rule, of the centralization of rule, of the thwarting of democratic aspirations and more pluralistic political aspirations in these movements. And so the question here is there a disjuncture between the way that social scientists usually talk about, and people, including myself, think about and write about urbanization, and the way that these issues are actually being debated on the ground? And so a disjuncture with the way that urban issues are usually framed, which is usually around this post-1985 movement. And I frame this as post-1985. 1985 was the year of the signing of the Plaza Accord between the United States and Japan. This was a moment when You saw an increase in the valuation of the Japanese yen as a result of this accord, led to a tremendous offshoring of Japanese capital to Southeast Asia, that then led to rapid urban expansion, an influx of foreign direct investment, an influx of finance to invest in new real estate developments, infrastructure developments, and so on. And so that kicks off a period of globalization and rapid urbanization. So scholars talk about globalization, they talk about financialization, the increasing growth of international finance and the increasing flows of finance into spaces like these three cities of Jakarta, Metro Manila, and Bangkok for investment in urban infrastructure and real estate, dynamics of gentrification. These are the kinds of ideas that are afoot in urban scholarships. But again, the argument here is that we need to actually listen to movements on the ground and understand the context in which we're framing our debates. And so an alternate framing developed through reflection on this Cold War moment is that, in fact, these three cities, Bangkok, Jakarta, and Metro Manila, are in fact, the kind of critical comparative lens that we might bring to them really centers this moment of the Cold War, that these are all major political and economic centers. They're the capitals of their respective countries, but also the major economic centers of countries that were framed in US foreign policy as Cold War frontline states. So each of these countries came to be viewed at this critical moment of the 1960s and 70s, at this moment when the United States was heavily involved in ramping up the war in Vietnam, as frontline states in the defense of the region against communism, that saw the imposition of authoritarian oligarchic regimes at a formative moment of political violence. And in each of these cases, the US State Department, CIA, US Agency for International Development were there in support of the development of these oligarchic authoritarian regimes. It subsequently saw massive globalization-driven growth, but that the consequent issues of inequity, dispossession, and ecological damage through urbanization that have been experienced during this period of globalization are experienced in part as a reckoning of path dependencies of political violence and authoritarian imposition, precisely because the actors, the institutions, the laws that drove and that shaped those processes of urbanization took shape during this Cold War period. And so a revised temporality that centers this period of the Cold War, that doesn't necessarily, disregard the impact of globalization. Obviously, we've seen a period of tremendous urban and economic growth since the 1980s, but rather places that moment in the context of a broader history, a broader post-colonial history of the region. And so this revised temporality goes something like the following, that Southeast Asia experienced a period of colonization, of course, of colonial rule. The Dutch in Indonesia, the Americans and the Spanish in the Philippines. Thailand, of course, famously was never formally colonized, but many kind of historians have argued that Thailand experienced something that is often referred to as kind of a neo-colonialism or a crypto-colonialism, in the sense that in response to the impositions of the British and the French and the possibility of formal colonization of Thailand by the French, the Thai monarchs actually kind of restructured governance in Thailand, deliberately modeling Thai governance on British and French and Dutch colonial institutions as a means to make Thai kind of governance and the Thai economy legible to the colonial powers, and in order to engage in trade with the colonial powers. And so this period of colonization, and then you had the post-colonial period, during which you had a period of debate and of imaginations of alternative possible futures. Should these societies be non-aligned or aligned? Should they follow a socialist path or a more capitalistic path? Should they reintegrate into global supply chains, or and if so, how should they do so in a way that maintains their autonomy? Those kind of debates then were violently cut short during this period of the Cold War and the political violence that installed these authoritarian regimes, and the reconcentration of and recentralization of political power, and the reintegration of these societies into a pattern of global trade that now is centered on the United States. And so the post-1985 moment of globalization happens, in contexts where you see this reconcentration of power in the hands of a discrete set of people. And so this reframing of the temporality of the way that we think about urban change in contemporary Southeast Asia. Let me shift now to talk a little bit about why this is important. Why is this reframing and this shifting of the temporality of our analysis of urbanization important to the way that we think about contemporary urban development issues in these three countries, Thailand, the Philippines, and Indonesia? Well, I would argue that it's important because the institutional, political, legal, and discursive legacies that shape debates about urban development in Jakarta, Metro Manila, and Bangkok today, in fact, again, are influenced and shaped by these post-Cold War contexts. And these cities are quantitatively, so the issues that we see them today are shaped by these institutional, legal, political legacies. And these cities are both quantitatively important because they're large and contain large concentrations of population, but they're also very important to their national politics and national economy. So they really do shape a national political debate and discourse as well. So to talk a little bit about the kind of growth that we've seen and to provide some numbers for this. Southeast Asia as a region was one of the most rapidly urbanizing regions in the world during the critical period of interest here from 1960 to 2000, about a fourfold growth in urban population, making it one of the most rapidly urbanizing regions in the world. It's important to note, though, that the spread of spatial extent of urban areas in Southeast Asia actually was much more rapid than that fourfold increase. At the same time that they were growing in terms of demographics, they were also sprawling and spreading spatially. And so you see this graphic on the right here shows the spread of urban extent in the Jakarta metropolitan region. The red areas show the built form. And you can see the way, and so to kind of interpret this a little bit, the inner polygon here is Jakarta proper, and then the larger polygon is the larger Jakarta metropolitan region. And you can see the way that the urban extent, the built form, buildings, roads, paved surfaces, and so on, spread dramatically and much more than that fourfold increase. And particularly from 1983 to 1995, this period of rapid foreign direct investment and urbanization, you see an explosion of the urban area of Jakarta out into its periphery. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that's important in a minute. But today, the cities, these three capital cities of these three countries, Jakarta, Manila, and Bangkok, are three of the largest metropolitan regions in the world. Jakarta, according to the United Nations World Urbanization Prospects released just last year, the largest city in the world at 42 million people. That's the metropolitan region, that larger polygon. Jakarta itself is about 11 or 12 million people. But again, we're talking about the larger metropolitan region. Metro Manila, about 25 million people, making it the 8th largest city in the world. And Bangkok, 18 million people, the 13th largest city. So very large concentrations of population, but also very large concentrations of economic activity. So Bangkok produces about half of the gross domestic product of Thailand, even though it's about a quarter of the population. Makati in Metro Manila, 90% of the bank headquarters. There's a very significant concentration of critical economic infrastructure within these three metropolitan regions. And so these metropolises really make or break political regimes as a result, I would argue. And the way that urbanization has unfolded in these three urban regions, I would argue, has been shaped by this Cold War dynamic, really shaped by successive waves of government plans to expand these metropolitan regions through infrastructure developments that are largely oriented towards opening up new lands for real estate development, creating new infrastructure projects to create new profit centers for economic interests within the country. What you see here is an image of a recent plan by the Japan International Cooperation Agency, JICA, which is the latest iteration of plans for large-scale infrastructure developments in Jakarta. So after an already explosive period of growth, yet larger plans for new rail corridors, toll roads, container ports, airports, and so on. And in fact, there's a history of this urban expansion and infrastructure development being oriented towards the development of real estate projects in the service of again, a discrete set of economic actors. And so that spiderweb graphic that I showed earlier that showed the Suharto family at the center of a network of conglomerates that are engaged in various urban developments. This map shows the locations of those urban developments. These are all new city within the city developments. Bumi Serpong Damai, 6,000 hectares, a massive project about the size of, I believe that's about the size of the city of San Francisco. There are a couple of dozen of these projects. Again, 80,000 hectares of land granted through location permits to these corporate allies of the Suharto regime during the period of the 80s and 90s. The image on the lower right-hand corner is of a project in Metro Manila, Bonifacio Global City, that's currently being built by the Ayala Land Agency, Ayala Land, which is a major conglomerate in the Philippines. So, so what I'm trying to paint here is a picture of a kind of an urban form that takes shape as a kind of an archipelago of these exclusive gated elite spaces as a result of this kind of focus of urban development on essentially the distribution of land to major conglomerates. This is a graphic from a paper I wrote about 15 years ago, in which I argued that infrastructure development in Metro Manila, in this case, is really driven as well by conglomerate interests. That at that time, the major new infrastructure initiatives that were being launched were largely unsolicited bids. So outside of government plans, these plans where essentially a conglomerate or a consortium of conglomerates get together to propose a new rail line or a new toll road or something like that, oriented largely towards linking up their property developments across the metropolitan region. So again, this argument that urban development takes the form of the linking up of an archipelago of exclusive spaces that arguably kind of reinforces the kind of spatial dichotomy and segregation that characterizes these three cities. And in the meantime, each of these cities also experiences a housing crisis. And so this is an image that I like to show in classes that I teach to illustrate the kind of housing dilemmas that face a city like Metro Manila, as is the city shown in this image. And what the image shows is an image of an informal settlement at the foreground. And in the background, you have the Manila International Container Port. At the time that I did my research in Metro Manila in the late 90s and early 2000s, about 40% of the population of Metro Manila lived in so-called informal settlements, where people illegally invade and occupy a piece of public or private land. And many of the people who lived in the informal settlement at the foreground actually worked in the container port. But the dilemma being that there's no way that people who are working as janitors or porters in that port can afford legal housing anywhere close to their residence. And so they are to a certain extent forced to live in these informal settlements. And in fact, I did a survey of a community in Bulacan province outside of Metro Manila. It's about I believe, 20 or 30 kilometers north of the container port. That community had been relocated from the port area 30 years ago. And yet residents of that community, many of them were still commuting back into the city to their jobs at the port, sometimes commuting up to 6 or 7 hours a day, so 3+ hours each way. And so these are the kinds of choices that residents of communities like this are faced with, either extremely arduous commutes or suboptimal housing circumstances. This pattern of urban development also has implications for the question of flooding. And so, each of the cities that's I'm interested in here, Jakarta, Metro Manila, and Bangkok, has seen significant flooding in recent years. Jakarta in 2007, major flood. Bangkok, 2011, Metro Manila, 2009. And the way that we often talk about flooding is in terms of sea level rise, right? That projections out to 2100 in the graphic on the left here, that by 2100, much of Jakarta will be inundated. This is, of course, why the national government of Indonesia has relocated the capital to Kalimantan. And yet, when we actually look at the flooding that's happened recently, sea level rise has very little to do with the flooding that's happened to date. That in fact, the major drivers of flooding have been, first of all, the geographic spread. This rapid geographic spread of urban space, which means increase in impervious surface, so that with climate change, we have increasingly intense precipitation falling on more and more paved surface so that the water can't percolate down into the aquifer. And so that then leads to more runoff and more flooding. And so what we have on the left here is a still from a model that was developed by the Philippine government in the Indonesian government in the aftermath of the major flood that hit Jakarta in 2007, that tries to understand what the drivers of flooding are. And what that model found was that it was uncontrolled urban development, particularly in the watershed area of Puncak to the south of Jakarta, but throughout the metropolitan region, that had driven this increase in runoff and increase in flooding. The other major driver and so that very much being a consequence of uncontrolled urban sprawl. The other major driver of flooding being land subsidence as a result of the extraction of groundwater, something that is also driven by essentially urban development and the development of condominiums and shopping malls within a relatively weak regulatory environment. And the Indonesian government's, as is true in the Philippines and Thailand as well, approach to flood mitigation has, I would argue, kind of doubled down on this logic of real estate-driven solutions to urban problems. And so the major kind of solution that was proposed to the flooding problem of Jakarta when I was doing my research in the mid-2010s was this Great Garuda project, which you might be familiar with, is a seawall that's supposed to be financed through the reclamation of land and the development of a new city along this bird-shaped set of islands. This project was extraordinarily controversial, in large part because there were questions about whether it would create a set of ecological catastrophes, whether it would displace large populations of people, whether it would actually work in terms of flood mitigation, whether there was enough of a market for the real estate development that was supposed to finance this project, but more broadly, why the solution to this problem had to take the form of another kind of land giveaway to large real estate developers. So ultimately, this project was scuttled in large part because of debates over those very issues, so that today Jakarta no longer has a kind of a long-range plan for flood mitigation. So that's kind of my argument for why this framing of this kind of reflection on the Cold War era and its legacies is important to thinking about contemporary urban issues. That in each of those cases, each of those sets of issues, it is questions of the kind of concentration of power at the center, of representation in politics, of the kind of social equity issues that emerge from, again, this oligarchic authoritarian legacy are at the center of debates about each of those issues. So I want to quickly touch on how I plan to study Cold War legacies, exactly what are the empirics of this study going to look like, before getting on to the last part of my presentation, which is to talk a little bit about theory. But you might be wondering exactly how do I plan to actually unpack these Cold War legacies. I'll say very quickly that the substance of the book is going to be the following, that essentially I'm going to look at institutional, legal, political, and discursive legacies from the Cold War in each of these three areas. First of all, property rights, land, and dispossession. In what ways did authoritarian regimes that arose during the Cold War reshape institutions, laws, and politics around land rights and property rights? I'll probably focus on Jakarta as my case study. I've done some research on that question in the past. Secondly, the production of knowledge about the urban. In what ways did authoritarian regimes reshape knowledge production in terms of the administration and governance of universities, in terms of the kind of knowledge that was produced by major development agencies like the National Economics and Social Development Board in Thailand or Bappenas in Indonesia. And then finally, urban subjectivities, policies and plans around rural to urban migration and the kind of policy and plans towards migrants to the city and how they integrate into the city. So that's kind of, I'm going to have chapters on each of these topics that will make up the substance of the book. But as noted, I want to kind of finish by talking a little bit about theory and some of the theoretical ideas that I have been thinking through as I think about how to frame this study, which, as you probably already have the impression, is still somewhat at a formative stage. I still am really building the theory, doing the research. And so have been writing in earnest since I got to APARC, but still very much a work in progress. But essentially, you know, I've looked to three sources of theoretical inspiration as I've been thinking through this project. And each of these three sources of inspiration, and thinking about the ways that these three sets of ideas intersect, answer three kind of sub-questions that animate this study. The first of these questions is, how did Cold War era political violence transform urban politics? In other words, what function did this period of the Cold War and the political violence during the Cold War play in reshaping urban politics? Here I've been influenced, if you can follow the color coding, by Cedric Robinson and his ideas of racial capitalism. Second, how did the context of these three different societies, which are quite different in terms of their colonial legacies, in terms of their political histories, how did the context of these societies shape the timing and form of the political violence and the changes it wrought? And finally, how do we explain, and here I'm interested in contemporary debates in Southeast Asian historiography, and finally, how do we explain the persistence of the institutional, legal, and political legacies of the Cold War political violence? And here I'm interested in Jeffrey Winters and his ideas on oligarchy. So first, the question of how did Cold War era political violence transform urban politics? Again, influenced here by the work of Cedric Robinson and his seminal book, Black Marxism and the Making of the Black Radical Tradition. Robinson is a sociologist who is from across the Bay at Oakland, taught at the UC Santa Barbara for a number of years. His kind of period of academic productivity was really in the 1970s and 80s. And his book, Black Marxism, came out in 1979. So it's an old set of ideas, but it's kind of experiencing a resurgence in contemporary scholarship. And I think for good reasons, because it's an interesting set of ideas. But essentially what Robinson does is in this book is he launches a critique of Marx's theory of history, which is centered on class struggle as a central dynamic in shaping contemporary history. And the way that he critiques Marx's theory of class struggle is through two methodological moves. The first is by developing new insights by shifting the temporality of analysis. So Robinson argues that Marx developed his theory of class struggle by observing the formation of a working class in Europe during the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. But he argues that if you actually shift the temporality backwards, you will find that in each instance that Marx analyzes, that formation of a working class was preceded by a process of the construction of new racial categories and new ethnic categories, and the kind of framing of populations as racially and ethnically degenerate or inferior as a precondition to the subsequent exploitation of those groups as a working class. So therefore, Robinson argues that all capitalism and racism and racial categorization are inherently intertwined dynamics. so that all capitalism is in fact racial capitalism. That's the first of his methodological moves. The second is his insistence on learning from epistemological starting points of movements on the ground. He says that he came to his insights about racial capitalism by observing the rhetoric of what he calls the Black radical tradition, Black power movements at the time that he was writing, and so on. And so I think you can see a resonance with the way that I'm framing my study with the way that Robinson frames his. I similarly am arguing for a kind of a shifting of our temporal analysis from the era of globalization to a preceding era of political violence. And I similarly am arguing that we need to learn from movements on the ground. The reason for that resonance is because I'm directly influenced by Robinson and thinking in this regard. So Jody Melamed is a sociologist who's done a wonderful job of kind of translating some of Robinson's ideas. His writing is actually quite dense, and she does a nice job of synthesizing some of the core insights. And so I'll read this quote from Melamed, which I think really sums things up nicely. Melamed writes that capital can only, this is summarizing Robinson's idea of racial capitalism. Capital can only be capital when it is accumulating, and it can only accumulate by producing and moving through relations of severe inequality amongst human groups. These antinomies of accumulation require loss, disposability, and the unequal differentiation of human value. And racism enshrines the inequalities that capitalism requires. Most obviously, it does this by displacing the uneven life chances that are inescapably a part of capitalist social relations onto fictions of differing human capacities, historically race. So I want to get ahead of what some of you might be thinking, which is, am I arguing that race and ethnicity are the critical variables for thinking about Southeast Asia? And I would say, no, that is not what I am arguing. Race and ethnicity are variables in the kind of social dynamics that you see in Southeast Asia today. But what I am arguing is this, but they're not the only variables. What I am arguing is this, that what you see at these moments of Cold War political violence is in fact the reinscription of relations of severe inequality amongst human groups, the reimposition of dynamics of loss, disposability, and the unequal differentiation of human value, and the reinscription of uneven life chances. This was a moment when, as these societies were being reincorporated into a US-centered kind of economic order, when you saw authoritarian regimes emerge and use political violence as a means to discipline populations into this new economic order in this way. And so that takes in part, a kind of the form of the dynamics of ethnicization that Robinson is interested in, but it also takes the form, I would argue, of the creation of new categories of informality, of the framing of rural and rural-urban migrant groups as inherently degenerate, and so on. And so one of the questions that I'm posing in this study then is, to what degree, how, and through what agency have relations of severe inequality amongst human groups, to use Melamed's framing, been woven into the urban fabric of Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines through these Cold War moments. The second set of ideas, again, posing the question, how did the context of these societies shape the timing and form of political violence that each of these societies experienced, informed here by contemporary historiographical debates in these three countries. And I've been really taken in kind of reading some of the historiographical literature from Thailand, the Philippines, and Indonesia, at the ways in which historians in these three societies, in fact, consistently evoke Cold War legacies in the way that they argue for a reframing of the history of these three countries. So I've been influenced, for example, by Ariel Herianto in his critique of Southeast Asian studies, essentially as a Cold War kind of constructs that privilege the ideas of Western scholars over the production of scholarship and knowledge about Southeast Asia by Southeast Asian scholars themselves. Reynaldo Ileto and his idea of an unfinished revolution in the Philippines. It's really about the ways in which the kind of post-colonial moment in the Philippines fostered a set of debates about what an autonomous and independent Philippine society should look like, that then were undermined and circumscribed by the Marcos regime. And then finally, Thongchai Wanichakun and his ideas of Kwampentai or Thai-ness. And I'll dwell a little bit on Thongchai's ideas because I've found them very inspirational and because I think there's resonance between Thongchai's ideas and Cedric Robinson's ideas on racial capitalism. So Thongchai is one of my academic heroes, a fascinating scholar who himself was the victim of Cold War political violence. He was involved in a demonstration at Thammasat University in 1976. It was violently put down. There was an invasion of the Thammasat campus by paramilitary groups, a slaughter of students, women were raped, dozens of students were murdered, bodies were desecrated. There's an infamous image from that day, October 6, 1976. This is a Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph of the violence of that day. Thongchai himself had to flee the campus, was eventually arrested, jailed for several years. And when he got out of jail, he went to Australia to do a PhD, really seeking to kind of understand what the genesis of that violence that he had been subject to and his fellow students had been subject to was. And what he ended up studying was mapping. And his book, Siam Mapped, is a brilliant study. And essentially what he argues in this book is that prior to Southeast Asia's colonial era, Thailand and other countries in Southeast Asia, were not, well, the colonized countries had become nation states in a sense, but Thailand was not a nation state in the modern sense and didn't have fixed boundaries that defined itself as a nation state, but that as the British and French and other colonial powers encroached on Thailand, the Thai monarchs commissioned the production of a series of maps that delineated the geo-body of a nation state, as Thongchai puts it. And, the problem then being that once you've defined the territory of a nation state, you have to send armies out to defend that territory, and you have to construct a national identity which coheres that sense of nationhood. And you have to kind of enforce that sense of nationhood. And so that then gives rise to an ideology of what Thongchai refers to as Kwampentai, or Thai-ness, the essence of being Thai, which he essentially argues becomes a kind of a cudgel that successive Thai governments use to discipline populations, and that at the Cold War moment became a mechanism that the military authoritarian regime used to essentially label any opposition as un-Thai and therefore subject to violence as a way to legitimize violence. And so that in fact is what he and his fellow students experienced. And that in fact, that is what continues to define a critical political discourse today. The image at the lower right-hand corner of the red shirt movements. There was significant violence directed against the red shirt movement in 2010, especially again, a military orchestrated massacre that led to the deaths of many dozens of people. Again, Thongchai's argument is this ideology of Kwampentai that has enabled that kind of violence. And again, the final kind of theoretical construct that I'm thinking through is this idea of oligarchy. And here I'm influenced by Jeffrey Winters, his book Oligarchy. Winters defines oligarchy as the politics of wealth defense by mere materially endowed actors. And he talks about oligarchy as a dynamic that shapes many different types of political systems. And so Winters is not talking about the 1%, in terms of like the dynamic through which the wealthy control politics. He's not talking about the 1% in the way that Bernie Sanders does. He's talking about a much smaller and more discrete group of people. The ways that the hyper wealthy, the extremely wealthy, are able to shape politics through their economic might and its influence on politics. And so in his book on oligarchy, Winters specifically focuses on Suharto's Indonesia and Marcus's Philippines as examples of what he calls a sultanistic oligarchy, which is a form of oligarchy that he says is centered on a single individual who exercises a kind of a broker role in mediating the emergence of this kind of extremely wealthy elite. And so he defines a sultanistic oligarchy as the defense of extreme material wealth, is a system in which the defense of extreme material wealth depends on personalistic rule, discretionary authority, and the favor of a dominant ruler rather than impersonal legal institutions. But he argues that with the shift towards more democratic rule and rule of law in Indonesia and the Philippines, we see not a disappearance of oligarchy, but rather its transformation into something more akin to what he calls a civil oligarchy, in which oligarchs rely primarily on impersonal, institutionalized rule of law rather than personal ties, coercion, or violence to defend and reproduce their wealth. And I won't go into this in the interest of time, but I think we can see debates about, if you read the headlines in newspapers in the Philippines, Thailand, and Indonesia today, you will see dynamics of oligarchy being kind of litigated in contemporary political debates up until the current time. So bringing these three kind of sets of ideas together, I've begun to think about the Cold War as a moment when violence was applied to empower the state to realize new opportunities for profit for an oligarchic elite by reasserting relations of political and social inequality and reintegrating these societies into global value chains. And that the inequalities produced through this moment have fostered dynamics of wealth defense. In other words, this continuing kind of defense of pathways to wealth by an entrenched set of economic interests that continue to shape politics to date. So that I'll conclude there. I'll simply raise the question as to how this idea of thinking about contemporary urban issues as legacies of the Cold War and a reckoning of Cold War legacies, how that might apply beyond these two cases, the three cases that I've talked about here, possibly to other cases. Does it bring kind of new comparative lenses to bear, bringing Southeast Asian cases into conversation with cases elsewhere, perhaps in Central America or the Middle East and other cases where you've seen instances of the restructuring of societies through Cold War political violence. And so I'll conclude with that.
Thank you for taking us through that amazing landscape, both figuratively and metaphorically, of Southeast Asian urbanization, Cold War. I have a question about the conjuncture you're suggesting of the Cold War and the creation of authoritarian oligarchies. In the case of Thailand, Thailand is an absolute monarchy until 1932. So, which is why, of course, almost all of central Bangkok is owned by the crown and provides the $47 billion fund that is now personal property of the King of Thailand. So from 1932, when the constitutional monarchy begins, you have the same series of military-backed coups and the, 9 or is it now 11 changes of constitution since the 1930s. The same pattern that we have today. When there's dissatisfaction with the civilian government, it's simply removed, a new constitution is produced, a new government is produced. So what is unique about the Cold War conjuncture in terms of of that domination of Thailand by the money Bangkok elite, the military, and the monarchy? In the case of Indonesia, I was wondering, you referenced the law, Law 51, 1960, which enabled dispossession and so forth. That law is a product of the Sukarno era, not of the Suharto era, which suggests, as one would think, that oligarchic interests are well established already. In the case of the Philippines, where I don't really know very much, but certainly my understanding is that the same group of whatever it is, 80 families or 60 families that own almost all of the land in the Philippines have done so since the colonial era and still do so today. So how did the Cold War produce a structural transformation of the concentration of power, would be my question.
Great. Can I answer that? Because I think it's a really, really rich and complex question before we take other questions. Yeah, okay, great. And I don't think I need that because I got a mic on, right? Yeah. Really Great question. And I think it speaks, there's a lot of nuance here, which I perhaps have papered over a lot in the presentation. So I'll take it piece by piece. In terms of Thailand, there's a lot of scholarship that suggests that essentially the monarchy was on the wane, particularly in the post-1932 period. As you note, the People's Party revolution that unseated the absolute monarchy and subsequently really brought the Crown Property Bureau, which I believe at that time was called the Privy Purse Bureau, under much greater kind of central kind of administration and regulation. And so there was a weakening of the Crown's control over those resources, but also I would argue a kind of a relative inability of the Crown. Crown was really weak post 1932, and early in the regime of King Bhumibol was really didn't play a very strong political role. But what most kind of historians talk to is the kind of post the moment of Sarit Tanarat's prime ministership from 1963 on, the way in which he built a connection between a military authoritarian regime and the Crown, using the Crown as a source of legitimacy, and in return granting new privileges and powers to the Crown, including increased control over the Crown Property Bureau, that then led to this kind of mutual influence in which the Crown Property Bureau became incredibly powerful and wealthy, and made the Thai monarchy arguably the wealthiest monarchy in the world, and the Thai monarch arguably one of the wealthiest people in the world. And so it's interesting, that idea of a sultanistic oligarchy that I was talking about at the end. I've been thinking about whether Thailand fits into that, and whether one can think of the monarchy as an institution that kind of plays that role as a power broker, a kind of economic power broker in Thai society. But that would be my response there, that the Crown was disempowered in the post-People's Party revolution era and after the end of the absolute monarchy, and that changed in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. In terms of Indonesia, yes, I mean, I don't want to overemphasize the extent to which authority was centralized under Sukarno, and that there was continuity into the Suharto era. What I would say is that the application of Law Number 51 of 1960 in new ways by the Suharto regime towards the advancement of certain economic interests, as opposed to anti-insurgency and other kinds of public and national security rationales, maybe is something different. But there's very little doubt, I think, and there's a lot of scholarship that indicates the way in which Suharto really used the infrastructure of land management to direct political privilege to certain groups, and the emergence of those oligarchic interests being very much an element of a product of his regime. In terms of the Philippines, I think you're right, is very different. Philippines had a pre-formed oligarchy in the way that Thailand and Indonesia didn't, in the form of a landed elite, essentially plantation-owning elite. And so to a certain extent, Marcos, his role was not so much as to foster and create an elite, as to consolidate the hold of that elite through the militarization of politics and through the consolidation of central rule at a moment of political pluralism that arguably posed some threat to oligarchic rule. I don't know. That's a work in progress, that thought, but I think you're right that the Philippines does stand out as a different kind of case because of the existence of this preformed kind of oligarchy that was a product of Spanish and colonial kind of plantation-oriented economies and the way that they were governed. Yeah.
Just kind of curious. So I followed your bit on racial capitalism, like maybe 50%.
Yeah.
It was kind of dense, I think. Packed a lot into a couple slides, but it is quite an interesting theory. How do you usually apply it? So I think one of the really interesting things about Southeast Asia, right, is it's one of the only places in the world where you have this flipped script between, who's economically powerful and who's the oppressed versus the oppressor, right? Because you have the issue with the oppression of the Chinese by basically all the host populations in the region. So when you apply this framework to sort of like what you see there with the dynamics between host populations and the Chinese elite, and then also kind of also linking it towards oligarchy, where certainly Cold War favoritism and colonial favoritism led to some of the oligarchical setups in Southeast Asia, but also, just some of the ways in which the Chinese or the overseas Chinese of that region tended to, basically form conglomerates and really large corporations, also as, almost like a protection layer, right? Strength in numbers. Yes, I guess when you think about that, how do you link it to this framework?
Yeah. I don't want to overplay this question of race and ethnicity. Again, what I find generative about Robinson's ideas is this central idea that in order for, again, a working class to form, there needs to be a rationalizing basis for the kinds of subordination and exploitation that working class is going to experience, and that doesn't necessarily, again, need to take the form of racial difference. And so I'm, again, not saying that race is the critical variable. I'm saying that at this moment you see other kinds of ways of building rhetorics of differentiation between populations and mechanisms to enable, for example, the taking of land by discrediting the land claims of existing populations or weakening land claims. So that's the kind of argument I'm making. The question you're raising about the ethnic Chinese in particular, I think, is a really interesting one. That is a part of the dynamic. I mean, in the case of Thailand, for example, a lot of the kind of political violence that was directed against demonstrators, for example, in 1976, was rationalized based on the idea that somehow these people were un-Thai in the sense that they were Chinese agents, that they were Vietnamese agents. I think and this differs between the different contexts. So in Thailand, for example, the ethnic Chinese have integrated more readily into politics and the economy. And so those kind of differences don't play as strong a role in political dynamics. In Indonesia, on the other hand, the ethnic Chinese are largely excluded from formal participation in politics because of their ethnic and religious and other forms of difference. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I do think you're playing on an interesting kind of question that is at play in a lot of what I'm talking about. So I don't know if you have a follow-up question, but I'm just thinking out loud about the question that you're raising. But you're right; it's not clear when we talk about the ethnic Chinese, exactly. You can't think of them simplistically as being an oppressed group, because they do wield, at least the relatively economically powerful amongst them do wield a relatively strong economic and political role. Yeah.
So the regimes of those three countries, their shared opposition to communism, was communism kind of just a way to differentiate people to then use laws to take things away from them? Or was the ideological anti-communism also part of the urban policy and planning, if that makes any sense?
I mean, I think the kind of timeline that I'm drawing is that there was this moment when this moment of anti-communism and this rationale of anti-communism was used to essentially rationalize the imposition of a certain form of rule that then led to the development of political discourses, institutions, political structures that initially actually were used for example, in the Suharto regime, in economic management more generally. So the bottom line is no, I'm not necessarily saying that there's a direct link between anti-communism and urban policy, so much that the reformation of, for example, laws around land relations, around rural-urban migration came to be reshaped during the Cold War period in ways that later had implications for urban policy. And the construction of oligarchy being another element, that the construction of oligarchy that you see in each three of the cases later kind of created the kind of class dynamic and political social dynamic that shaped urban development in the ways that I outlined in the presentation. Through, for example, the privileging of certain oligarchic elites in real estate development and infrastructure development.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I actually have two rather disparate questions, if I may. The first one is, could you comment on the salience of examining flooding as sort of like a driver of geographic and political change in urban areas, like as opposed to, say, you bring up subsidence like drought or other natural disasters shifting with climate change in the region? And then the second question is, can your theoretical framework consider or comment on like futurisms where we are not living in a US-centric globalized economy?
Yeah. Can you expound a little bit on the first part of the question?
Yeah, why did you choose, or why flooding as opposed to other natural disasters that urban areas face?
I mean, what initially got me interested in the dynamic of flooding was that, to my mind, first of all, it is an existential crisis that the cities under examination here all face. Jakarta, much of it likely will be underwater, barring any major infrastructural intervention. But it is also something that implicates everything that urban planners think about and do. Basically, it implicates everything that we do in the urban built environment that has an implication for the relationship between land and water. When we build anything, we are impacting the ability of the water to percolate into the aquifer. When we suck water out of groundwater out, we're creating land subsidence. All of these kind of all decisions that planners make have implications for the watershed. And so to me, it therefore raises interesting questions about the future of urban planning more generally. And so to me, it is a fascinating kind of question, set of questions to ask. So that's my answer to the first. Can you repeat the second question? Yeah. I mean, I think we're at a really interesting moment right now. Just in the last week, watching what's happening in Venezuela, and this kind of increasing rhetoric coming out of the Trump administration about essentially the world increasingly being divided into spheres of influence, in which the West, the Americas essentially are the U.S. sphere of influence, a kind of rekindling of the Monroe Doctrine, which then seems to concede that Asia is the bailiwick of other powers, perhaps Japan and China, which then leads to interesting questions about, part of what the project is doing is kind of linking geopolitical change to social political change within specific societies to then the kind of urban dynamics that emerge from that change. And so it's interesting to kind of pose a question as to how the changing geopolitical order will lead to changing influences. I've been increasingly interested in, and there's been a shift in Indonesia, for example, towards the empowerment of state-owned enterprises in urban development. And one of the kind of hypotheses that's been at the back of my mind is that might be a reflection of different influences on Indonesian politics right now, specifically the so-called China model as an emerging model for thinking about urban development globally. And the China model being very much centered on state control over land and state-owned enterprises as critical actors in shaping the urban environment. And the fact that some of the major urban development projects that are taking place in Jakarta right now are occurring through partnerships between China and Indonesia, kind of further deepens that question for me. To what extent is that translating into influence in terms of an imperative for Indonesia to empower the state empower state-owned enterprises to play a stronger role in urban development.
I was just going to tag on to the SOE bit. Sorry, I was just going to tag on to the SOE bit quickly with Indonesia. So one of my really good friends, who is substantially older than me, has been doing business down there in Indonesia for 30 years. And I was talking to him last month, visited him out in Hong Kong. And, what he is seeing, and I think what a lot of other people in the region are seeing, right, is both the economies of China and Indonesia, which are sort of the anchor economies of East and Southeast Asia, are sliding fast and hard. And so you're seeing this movement towards, more utilization of SOEs. But really, at least from his perspective as an entrepreneur, he is just generally seeing a lot more restrictions placed upon private capital, with the idea that it basically goes to the state, and generally a lot more moments of, can you spare some change for a friend in need, so to speak, with corruption. And so I suppose, a different perspective, which is that, his, is that you're just sort of seeing basically two extraordinarily corrupt governments, which are now sort of using state-owned enterprises as shields for basically moving money and moving public funds towards themselves.
Which is another spin on an oligarchy kind of argument. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, a very good talk here. I was just wondering if you're talking about the three Southeast Asian countries. You really didn't mention much about Singapore, which is probably between number one or number two city to do business. According to all the business journals. Next to Switzerland. And wondering the influence of Singapore to those regions. And just, I'm an architect and planner as well. And I noticed when I was working on a project in China back in the late aughts, that the colors they used in Chinese planning was actually directly derived from Singapore, because I worked in Singapore in the mid-90s. And so I found out that the Singaporeans had gone into China and actually were asked by the Chinese to help them in urban planning. So kind of thinking about, if China is influencing these countries, how much, the root is really, in the Singapore planning. So just kind of your thoughts about that.
Sure. I'm fascinated by Singapore. I think it's a different kind of case than the three cases that I was just discussing, in part because it's a city-state. And in part because it's dominated by ethnic Chinese migrants to the region, and so it really is. It's a different kind of political, social dynamic. But one of the things that the Singaporean government did early on was to take through compulsory purchase most of the land in Singapore. 85% of the land, I believe, or 85% is owned by the state, and then to use that as much in the way that China has used land as a mechanism to finance large-scale infrastructure development. And so this kind of model of land monetization is a model for infrastructure development, housing development. 85% of the population of Singapore lives in publicly built housing. And so to a certain extent, it represents the antithesis of the highly privatized model of planning that you see in the Philippines, Indonesia, and Thailand. And so it really stands as a contrasting case as opposed to a comparable case, although you did also see the emergence of an authoritarian government that used an anti-communist rationale for a political takeover, although it then took the logic of that state power in a very different way than the three cases that I've just talked about, and in a way that granted power to the state as opposed to a set of powerful economic interests. in terms of the influence on China, I think there's been mutual influence back and forth, but I think Singapore has been very influential in China in terms of bringing technical knowledge, and you probably know a lot more about this than I do as somebody who's actually worked in this field, to China. And so you see the fingerprints of Singaporean planning all over China's kind of model, again, of cross-subsidization of its land holdings. China's fascinating in that all urban land, according to the Constitution, is owned by the state. And the Chinese state has really used that dominance of the land market as a mechanism to finance infrastructure in a way that I think it represents some learning from the Singapore case in a very interesting way.
One last question, because then I'll take it quickly. So the case selection, the three cases,
Yes.
There are ways to just, I mean, the three biggest cities, perhaps aside from Singapore. But I think if you want to push this argument about the impact of Cold War legacies, it might be interesting to also talk about, well, Singapore was already mentioned, Vietnam, country like Vietnam, that was on the sort of other side of the Cold War,
Right.
and how that impacted the subsequent development, urban development in Vietnam in a different way. Second quick question is following up on the excellent question from the back. So if you don't need to emphasize race and ethnicity as a component, then the question is, why do you need Cedric Robinson? I mean, you don't need racial in the racial capitalism argument, right? Marx is enough, seems to be enough to me. So why would you need that argument?
Yeah. Again, so to answer the first question, the second question first, I need to think about how I'm using Robinson, because I've presented this a few times and people get caught up on this idea of race being the critical variable. But I think that the fundamental idea that this kind of moment of imposition, kind of reintegration of these economies into a US-centered global capitalist order required a disciplining of populations is what I'm trying to get at. And maybe I can get at that through some other set of ideas beyond Robinson. But I think, again, I was initially, a long time ago, kind of influenced by this idea of shifting the temporality of analysis and looking at those preceding moments of political violence that then lead to the kind of economic dynamic of the creation of a working class that you see later on. So agreed that I need to think about how I'm presenting it and think about whether there are other ideas that get me there faster than Robinson. In terms of other cases, I mean, again, the argument here is that these three particular societies were places that were considered frontline states by the US government during a critical moment in the Cold War. And that is what makes them comparable. Obviously, Vietnam's, was also a frontline state, but it ultimately became communist. So you don't have the same kind of timeline that you can follow to compare with these three cases. I think other cases that I might look at are probably more, Turkey or Egypt or Guatemala. I mean, other places that were frontline societies that arguably possibly saw a similar political and economic dynamic emerge. South Korea is another interesting one, although South Korea went in a very different direction in terms of the relative strength. Again, I'm kind of contrasting these three societies with other states that became more developmental: Korea, Taiwan, Singapore being primary amongst them. But nonetheless, I hear that note, and it's something I'll give some thought to. What exactly makes these three societies different from Korea, for example?
What about Malaysia?
Malaysia is another one, yeah.
They developed one in the West.
Right, but it didn't quite see the same level of US interventionism. I mean, these three societies, and I could talk at length about exactly why the US policy focused on these three societies: Thailand, because it was right next to Indochina; Philippines, because it's a former colony; Indonesia, because it was just a critical case. And it was something that the US State Department was very strongly focused on. So Malaysia, I think, stands out as a little bit different from these three cases, but nonetheless, it's something I've thought about. So yeah.